In the village of Abaca, there lived a woman named Uku. She was unlike any other. Her beauty was undeniable: smooth skin, bright eyes, and an aura that made heads turn wherever she went. But beauty was not what people whispered about when they spoke her name. It was fear. Uku was feared by men throughout the village, not because of sorcery or wickedness, but because of her sheer strength and ruthlessness. Unlike the other young women in Abaca, Uku did not giggle or blush when men approached her. She did not entertain their flattery or accept their gifts. Instead, she met their advances with fury. Any man who dared to get too close, speak too sweetly, or try to charm her would find himself on the ground, bruised, beaten, and humiliated. The village men knew better than to challenge her, for many had felt the force of her fists. Some carried the marks of her wrath on their faces, others in their aching bones. Despite her violent reputation, many men still found themselves drawn to her. They admired her from a distance, whispering among themselves about her wild nature. Some believed they could tame her, others saw her as a challenge. But all who tried met the same fate: pain and rejection. Uku was not merely cold-hearted, she was an unbreakable wall. No man had ever seen her smile, nor had anyone won her affection. But why? Why did she harbor such hatred? Why did she fight so fiercely against any man who dared to come near? The village elders, the women, and even the children all wondered the same thing. What had made Uku this way? Despite the bruises and broken bones, many men still found themselves drawn to Uku. Her beauty was captivating, her presence magnetic, and her strength, though terrifying, was unlike anything they had ever seen. Some believed that if they approached her gently, with kind words and thoughtful gifts, they could soften her heart. Others, more arrogant, thought that their status or charm would make them the exception. One by one, they tried. The blacksmith's son brought her bracelets made of the finest silver, hoping that jewelry would win her favor. She took the gift in her hands, examined it for a brief moment, then tossed it into the river without a word. The blacksmith's son, humiliated, did not dare speak to her again. A wealthy merchant's son tried next, offering her a basket of exotic fruits from distant lands. Uku took one look at the offering and said, "I do not accept gifts from those I do not trust." She then turned away, leaving the merchant's son standing there, speechless. Then came the most confident of them all, the chief's son. Unlike the others, he did not bring gifts. He did not plead or flatter. He approached her with an air of authority, as if he expected her to respect him simply because of who he was. "No woman has ever dared to refuse me," he declared with a smug grin. Uku did not hesitate. Before he could utter another word, her fist struck his face with such force that 2 of his teeth flew from his mouth. He fell to the ground, groaning in pain, blood pooling at his lips. The village watched in silence, stunned by her boldness. No one had ever dared lay a hand on the chief's son. The chief, furious, wanted revenge. But even he knew that challenging Uku was not wise. Instead, he warned the men of Abaca, "Stay away from her. She's not like the others." And so, the men in the village learned a lesson: they could admire Uku from afar, but they could never claim her. Yet, despite her strength, despite her unwavering resistance, whispers still spread. Women in hushed voices asked the same question. Why does she fight so hard? No one knew the truth. No one understood the scars she carried, scars not visible on her skin, but buried deep in her heart. The village of Abaca had seen many strange things over the years: droughts, storms, and even a leopard that wandered into the marketplace once, but nothing puzzled them more than Uku. The men feared her, the women whispered about her, and the children watched her from afar, their eyes filled with curiosity and caution. But the village elders, wise and patient, had grown deeply concerned. A woman like Uku was unheard of in Abaca. She was strong, stronger than any man dared to admit. But more than that, she was angry. And the elders knew that anger was never born without reason. So, they called for her. One evening, as the sun cast its golden light over the village, Uku was summoned to the village square. The entire village gathered to watch. The elders sat in a circle on their wooden stools, their wrinkled faces calm yet serious. Uku arrived, standing tall, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. One elder, with a beard as white as the moon, cleared his throat. "Uku, child, we have called you here to understand. The village has seen your strength. We have seen how you fight the men who come near you. But tell us, why do you carry such hatred in your heart?" The village fell silent. The only sound was the distant rustling of the palm trees in the evening breeze. Uku's gaze was steady, her jaw tight. "I do not hate," she said, her voice firm. "I protect myself." The elders exchanged glances. Another elder leaned forward. "Protect yourself from what?" Uku said nothing. The village waited. The elders waited. But she did not speak. For the first time, the people of Abaca saw something strange, a crack in Uku's armor. A flicker of something in her eyes, something deep and buried. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. "I owe no one an explanation," she said, turning away. "You would not understand." And with that, she walked away, leaving the village with more questions than answers. That night, as the village returned to their homes, they whispered among themselves. What had happened to Uku? What pain did she carry that made her heart so unyielding? None of them knew that the answers they sought were buried in her past, locked away in a memory too painful to speak. That night, as the village of Abaca settled into silence, Uku lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small hut. The words of the elders echoed in her mind. Protect yourself from what? They would never understand. Her past was not just a memory, it was a wound, raw and unhealed. One that bled beneath the surface of her soul. A wound that had shaped her into the woman she had become. She was once a little girl who knew fear. Uku had grown up in a home filled with shadows. Her father was a man of great strength, not just in body, but in control. He was not the kind of man who spoke gently, nor did he listen when others spoke. His voice was law, his hands were heavy, and his temper was a storm that never passed. Her mother, a woman of quiet grace, had learned to live under his rule. She walked carefully, spoke softly, and obeyed without question. But no matter how careful she was, it was never enough. Uku, as a child, had watched in silence as her father's rage fell upon her mother. A misplaced bowl of food, a delayed response, a wrong look. Anything could ignite his fury. And when it did, her mother would shrink, her body curling in on itself like a leaf caught in the wind. Uku wanted to fight for her. She wanted to scream, to push him away, to stop his fists from landing. But she was small, weak, helpless. And then came the night that shattered everything. Her mother was pregnant, carrying a life that had not yet seen the world. There had been a small argument. Uku could not even remember what it was about. But she remembered the sound of her father's voice, sharp as a blade. She remembered the look in his eyes, dark and unforgiving. And she remembered the moment his hand struck her mother's stomach. Her mother fell. And when she did not get back up, Uku knew something was terribly wrong. She screamed for help, but no one came. By morning, both her mother and the unborn child were gone. Uku had never cried so much in her life. She had never felt such pain, such helplessness, and she had never hated a person more than she hated her father in that moment. But fate had its own way of justice. Her father did not live long after that. Some say it was sickness, others say it was the weight of his own sins. Uku did not care. His absence did not bring her peace, because the scars remained. When her father died, the village whispered that Ukko was finally free. They believed she would heal, that she would smile again, that the fear in her eyes would fade. They were wrong. Ukko was sent to live with her uncles, her father's brother's men, who were supposed to protect and care for her. But she quickly learned that their home was not a place of safety. It was a different kind of prison. Her uncles were no better than her father. They were men who carried the same hunger for control, the same cruelty, the same disregard for the women around them. Unlike her father, they did not raise their fists at her. No, they had no interest in breaking her bones. They wanted to break her spirit instead. Ukko saw how they treated their wives as property, as servants, as objects to command. The women in the household lived in quiet suffering, their voices stolen by fear. She watched them lower their eyes when spoken to, flinch when their husbands came too close, and endure pain in silence. But the worst part was when her uncles brought other women home. They would invite strangers, men from distant villages, men with greedy hands and cruel smiles. They would drink, laugh, and boast about their strength, about how a woman's place was beneath a man's will. Ukko hated them. She hated the way they looked at her, like she was something to be owned. She hated the way they spoke, as if women had no right to refuse them. She hated the way the women never fought back, not because they didn't want to, but because they were too afraid. It was in that house, surrounded by broken women and ruthless men, that Ukko made a vow. She would never be like them. She would never bow her head, never lower her voice, never allow a man to take anything from her. She was not like her mother, who had suffered in silence. She was not like her aunts, who had surrendered their freedom to fear. If no man had ever protected the women in her life, then she would become her own shield. And so, with each passing day, her heart hardened. Her hands, once small and delicate, became fists. Her voice, once quiet and hesitant, became sharp as a blade. And by the time she left that house, she was no longer just a girl. She was a storm. By the time Ukko left her uncle's home, she had changed. Gone was the little girl who once trembled in fear. Gone was the helpless child who had watched her mother suffer. In her place stood a woman with unshakable resolve, a woman who would never again be at the mercy of any man. But the village of Abaca was not ready for this new Ukko. At first, they only whispered about her. The women admired her silent strength, while the men regarded her with unease. She was unlike any woman they had known, untamed, unreadable, unwilling to submit to their ways. But it wasn't until the day at the marketplace that the village truly began to fear her. It was a busy afternoon, the air thick with the scent of roasted maize, fresh yams, and ripe fruits. People filled the market square, bargaining, laughing, and moving about in a lively rhythm. Ukko walked among them, her usual stern expression in place, her gaze cold and distant. She was picking vegetables from a merchant's stall when it happened. A young man, one of the village's more arrogant sons, was walking with his friends, boasting loudly about his strength. He had heard the stories of Ukko, but like many before him, he thought he could be the one to humble her. With a smirk, he stepped too close. "Ukko," he called, his voice dripping with mockery. "Why do you act like a man? A woman as beautiful as you should smile more. Maybe if you were softer, you would find a husband." His friends laughed. Ukko did not. She did not speak. She did not blink. But in the blink of an eye, her hand moved. Slap. The sound echoed through the market like the crack of thunder. The young man staggered back, clutching his cheek in shock. The entire market froze, the lively chatter dying instantly. People turned, their eyes wide with disbelief. The young man's face burned red with both pain and humiliation. He growled, his pride wounded. "How dare you?" Before he could finish, Uku moved again. Bam. Her fist struck his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his friends too stunned to intervene. A deep silence swallowed the market. Even the merchants who had been haggling loudly a moment ago now stood frozen, their goods forgotten. Uku stepped closer, standing over the struggling man. Her voice was calm, yet laced with a quiet fury. "Do not mistake me for the women you think you can control," she said. "I am not afraid of you. I will never be afraid of you." The young man did not reply. He only scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the crowd. When Uku turned to leave, the people of Abaca made way for her, parting like the sea before a mighty wave. From that day forward, the village knew Uku was not just a woman. She was a force. Word of Uku's strength spread like wildfire through the village of Abaca. The men who had once admired her beauty now spoke her name in hushed voices, warning each other to stay away. The women, especially those who had suffered in silence, looked at her with a mixture of awe and quiet respect. But not everyone feared her. The village prince, son of the great king of Abaca, was a man of confidence and charm. He had been raised with power, treated like royalty since birth. He had never met a woman who did not admire him, never encountered one who refused his attention. And when he heard of Uku, the woman who fought men without hesitation, his curiosity was piqued. "She is merely a wild horse," he told his friends with a smirk. "All she needs is the right rider." His companions laughed, agreeing that the prince, with his wealth and charm, would surely be the one to tame her. So, he set out to win Uku's heart. The prince's pursuit. Unlike the foolish young men before him, the prince did not approach Uku with arrogance. He was smarter than that. He knew force would not work, nor would empty flattery. Instead, he brought gifts, fine fabrics from distant lands, golden jewelry, and sweet fruits that were rare even in the king's palace. Uku did not reject the gifts, but she did not accept them either. She simply stared at them, then at him, her eyes unreadable. The prince took this as a sign of progress. For weeks, he continued his pursuit, visiting her often, speaking to her with respect, never overstepping his bounds. And for the first time, the villagers began to wonder, would Uku finally let her guard down? Would the prince be the one to change her? But Uku was not easily swayed. She did not smile at him, nor did she soften her words. She did not push him away, but neither did she welcome him. She remained cautious, watching him with the same cold, sharp gaze she gave to all men. Still, the prince believed he was making progress. And then, one fateful afternoon, he made a terrible mistake. It was a quiet day when the prince invited Uku for a walk by the stream. The air was cool, the water flowed gently, and for once, the village was at peace. As they walked side by side, the prince felt a swell of confidence. He had spent weeks by her side, and she had not pushed him away. Surely this meant she was beginning to trust him. And so, without thinking, he reached for her hand. The moment his fingers brushed against hers, the world seemed to stop. Uku's entire body tensed. A cold, sharp fury flashed through her eyes. To the prince, it was as if a storm had awakened in her soul. Before he could react, she struck. Bam. Her fist slammed into his chest with the force of a hammer. He stumbled back, gasping for air, his eyes wide with shock. But she wasn't done. POW. A second blow landed against his face, sending him crashing to the ground. Blood trickled from his lip, his vision spinning. The prince had never known pain like this. He had never been struck before, never felt the sting of humiliation in front of others. And now, as he lay on the dirt, staring up at the woman who had bested him, he understood. Uku was untouchable. His guards, who had been standing at a distance, rushed forward. But even they hesitated. This was Ukyu. The men of Abaca had all learned the hard way crossing her was dangerous. The prince, still struggling to catch his breath, managed to rise to his feet. He did not speak. He did not meet her gaze. Instead, he turned and left, his pride shattered, his heart burning with anger and shame. When the prince returned to the palace, bruised and battered, the entire court gasped in horror. No one had ever dared to lay a hand on him, let alone beat him to the ground. The king, a man of great pride and power, was furious. "Who has done this to you?" he roared. The prince, his pride wounded more than his body, clenched his fists. Ukyu. Silence fell upon the room. The name alone sent whispers through the halls. The king's face darkened. "Summon her," he commanded. Messengers were sent to the village, and soon, the people of Abaca gathered once more in the palace courtyard. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Would Ukyu finally meet her match? Would the king punish her for what she had done? Ukyu arrived, walking into the courtyard with her head held high. She was not afraid. She stood before the king, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. The king glared at her. "You struck my son," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "You humiliated the future ruler of this land. Do you have nothing to say for yourself?" Ukyu did not flinch. She did not bow. Instead, she met the king's gaze and said, "He touched me without my permission. He believed he could claim me like a prize. I will not allow any man to control me, not even your son." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had ever spoken to the king this way. The king's jaw tightened. "You think yourself above men? You think yourself untouchable?" Ukyu's voice was firm. "I think myself free." For a long moment, the king said nothing. His fury was evident, but so was something else: curiosity. He had heard of Ukyu's strength, but now, standing before her, he saw that her strength was not just in her fists. It was in her spirit. "Why do you hate men so much?" the king finally asked, his voice quieter now. Ukyu took a deep breath, and for the first time, in front of the entire village, she told her story. She spoke of her father's cruelty, of the mother she could not save, of the uncles who treated women as property, of the years she spent watching the suffering of women, learning that no one would ever protect them unless they protected themselves. She told them how she had vowed to never be like them, to never be weak, to never let a man take her freedom. By the time she finished, the entire courtyard was silent. The men of the village lowered their heads in shame. Some of them had mistreated women themselves. Some had laughed at their suffering, ignored their pain. And now, through Ukyu's story, they saw the truth. The women of the village, those who had lived in silence, looked at Ukyu with newfound respect. She had fought the battle they had always been too afraid to fight. Even the prince, who had once thought he could tame her, looked at her differently now. He saw not just a fierce woman, but a survivor. The king sat back on his throne, deep in thought. Then, after a long silence, he spoke. "No man in Abaca shall ever treat a woman with cruelty again," he declared. "What was done to you, Ukyu, was an injustice. It is time for change." The crowd murmured in shock. Could it be? Had Ukyu's story changed the heart of the king himself? The uncles who had mistreated women were punished. The men of the village were warned no more would women live in fear. And as for the prince,